Okay, we'll pick up with part two of where we left off. Environmental systems support economies. Here's the deal. When we talk about environmental support systems or environmental systems, there are a lot of different things out there that need our environment to make things happen. And so when we think about pollination of crops, so many of our crops, I think I've overheard it say that over a third of our crops are pollinated by birds, bats, bees, and I would venture to say that number is probably 2/3. I'm just guessing. Wind plays a major role, but think about this. Without them, we wouldn't have pollination, nutrient cycling, all of the micro and macro invertebrates, all of the bacteriums. People talk about slime mold. Slime mold plays a huge role in our environment. What about water purification? You think about where our wastewater goes. It goes to our water treatment plant. From our water treatment plant, once it's been treated, well, how does it get treated? Through bacteria and decomposition, natural processes. Or if you have a septic system in your backyard, same thing. Climate regulation. Trees absorb carbon dioxide. Marine algae absorb carbon dioxide. All of these things play a role in climate regulation. Forest lines, tree lines, mangrove along the coastal areas. These are all very important things, and they support really our economy. And so what happens is if we deplete natural resources or pollute too much, we degrade or break down these systems. And so ecosystem services are extremely huge. If you think about classic economics, right? So basically, you look at the market being driven through communities, and the competition for people to pursue their interests and say, I'm going to get as much as I can. It really does develop inequalities, the rich versus the poor. And we think about, should capitalism be restricted? Because it ultimately can cause an issue down the road when it comes to people who want to get as much as they can. Neoclassical economics basically says we have a supply and demand, and that port where the supply meets the demand, that's our equilibrium. And clearly, it's a system of buyer versus sellers. And so you cannot have an artificially stimulated market if we simply go with supply and demand. We can, however, change that if we are subsidizing those things, right? Marginal benefits, cost curves, again, it comes back to supply and demand, and then what's the cost for producing it, and where is the cost of using it. And so there's an optimal level, a threshold, if you will, where if the benefits are greater than the cost, man, we're going to do that. But if the cost is greater than the benefits, probably not going to see that happening. And so it's this optimum or this equilibrium again. If we look at wealth and jobs, they're coming from cost versus benefits, right? So the more cost effective it is, the more we're going to produce, the more the jobs, the more the wealth. But with that, we see environmental problems. So the more consumption, the more use of resources, the more we see environmental issues. And so if resources are not infinite, in other words, they are have a finite amount or a exact amount, then we're going to see this not take place. Basically, the neoclassical economics basically says the only thing out there is growth is good. We're going to do whatever we can to generate jobs, to generate money, and whatever comes out of it. But again, that's assuming that resources are infinite, and they're not. Resources, if we look at them, are manageable. And some models are sitting there saying, well, if we use them all up, then a resource replacement will be found. Listen, people, we live on a spaceship that's hurling through outer space, and what we have is what we got. Our resources are limited. Can we manage them to where they're not? If they're renewable resources can be depleted. Let's go back to the islands of Tikopia and Easter Island and the differences. Eastern Islanders destroyed everything. They had renewable resources. But non-renewable resources such as petroleum and other things like that, clearly we have to think about how fast we're using them. Now, of course, we use terms that are under human time frames. In other words, 100 years. Geologic time frame is totally different, right? So if you think about petroleum, 150 million years to make petroleum, geologically that's not very long. So we're dealing with our time frame. Okay, cost and benefits, right? So clearly cost and benefits plays a major role. When we think about pricing an item, a lot of times they ignore social issues, like is this being produced in a location that it hurts people, especially the poor or minorities or whatever. Environmental issues. Are we destroying our ecosystems? And then economic costs. Clearly, you've got to be able to support the cost of that. So externalities basically is the cost and benefits of people that are not involved in the buying or selling, right? So is someone getting a health problem because this is being manufactured in their community? Are we reducing the amount of resources as a result of it? These are external costs, and externalities are those people who are dealing with that illness or that issue. What are some long-term effects? Here's the deal. If we're discounting what happens in the future, then we're legitimately robbing Peter to pay Paul. We are stealing from our children, your children, our children's children. And there are long-term consequences of our actions, but a lot of time policymakers ignore that for the immediate gain, right? And so pollution, resource depletion come as a result of that. Economic growth is important, don't get me wrong, and we need that for social and employment. We need those things. We need to find ways to create opportunities for the poor to become into a middle class. Now, progress, of course, is always going to be measured by economic growth. Now, the reality is this. Sometimes that's not always progress. So if we look at the paradigm that growth is good, when we see growth, we see more consumption of fossil fuels, more health impacts, social disruption. We see this affluenza. In other words, people think they're entitled to everything. And as a result, it's this circle of death that causes more to be bigger and better, when in reality, as we do this, we use more and more resources and more pollution and more environmental issues. Affluenza, just to define that, affluenza is basically materials. You getting more is not getting you content. And I've always said that. Just to get more doesn't make you happy. And so we see this uncontrolled economic growth as a result of people wanting more and more and more and more. People believe that technology can solve anything. Those are cornucopians. But economists using that philosophy causes us to go down a path that may be unstoppable. Ecological economists, they're looking at the fact that we need to look at the environmental limitations. We need to make sure that we do not have a problem. It is a call for a revolution, if you will. Let's make sure we maintain our environment. Environmental economists, again, people who are looking for a way to stop pollution, become more efficient when it comes to resources, and take care of what we got. If we look at our steady state economy, John Stuart Mill, resources are going to become harder and harder to find as we see economic growth and as that growth slows and stabilizes. So we got to think about, okay, as we use more, it changes our way of life. Not a lower quality of life, but it changes it. So if we look at what economies are measured by, gross domestic product, so what's the goods and services they produce? Pollution will increase as so does GDP, right? Because we are producing more goods and services. So if we look at an indicator, a progress indicator, basically it's telling us when we are making positive contributions and when we are making negative impacts. So volunteer work, things like that, community service, those are positive contributions. Negative impact, crime, pollution. And so we can then measure where we're at with the GPI. Net economic welfare, it's just looking at your GDP and adjusting it by how much leisure time we have, how much environmental degradation. When we destroy the environment, it deducts. When we have leisure, it adds. Sustainable economic welfare. Basically, we're looking at the wealth distribution of resources on our planet. Income. What's going on there? This is not easy. It's hard to figure that out. And so when we're looking at things, what's important to you? What's the existence value, option value, scientific value, uses? How much aesthetics do you, or how much pleasing? What's the educational? But then, what about the cultural values? These things are hard to put prices on. These are things that we try to determine, and they're different for everybody. Contingent valuation, we're trying to determine how much people are willing to pay to protect or restore. Is it worth $100 million to restore the monarch butterfly? So, I mean, people are going to have different feelings on this. The reality is what do we have time for? What do we have money for? What are our revealed preferences versus our expressed preferences? Right? They measured one time, they said the global value of all ecosystem services altogether is $42 trillion. Right? Now all of a sudden you go, okay, when you take away from that, that reduces that. Market failure, gosh. When we see this, market failure is when we have a negative effect of the environmental things that are going on or people are causing, and as a result of that, what happens? The government comes in and they say, you know what? We need to make laws and regulations. What are green taxes? This is basically a tax that says if you do something wrong, you're going to get a tax for it. So, for example, the article that we have on taxing carbon for fossil fuel companies, right? Carbon tax credits. A great way for us to kind of look at things is eco-labeling, by telling the consumers what's sustainable and what's not. You know, we use organic, we use dolphin safe. You've probably seen that on tuna. What is helping you become what I refer to as environmentally conscious? How do corporations respond? Some of them do what's called greenwashing. Greenwashing is basically labeling something as organic or safe for the environment when it's really not. Yeah, Nike, the Gap, these guys are riding the wave. In conclusion, we've got to develop economic approaches that help us protect the environment, protect conservation, but allows us to grow. Economic health, social considerations. We need to make sure that we need to protect them. And then economic welfare. Without growth and economic health, environmental quality is an issue. That's all we got for today. Thanks for listening, and hope you have a great day.